This year, a mobile marketer named Miller Brown Mobile Researcher of the Year, which is a very exciting honor for us. And it's been a big focus, like I said, where all of the research that you're about to see throughout this report was done in-house at Miller Brown. A few other points of logistics before we go ahead and get started with the webinar. While it covers the industry broadly, we have also been doing a series of industry-specific webinars. We've already completed the travel and transportation webinars, so if you have questions in those areas, please feel free to ping us and we can send you some of that information. We do have 2 more still upcoming that you can watch out for. On October 29th, we'll be conducting a technology-focused webinar as it relates to mobile, and on November 5th, we'll be conducting a retail-focused webinar. That said, as we go through the content here today, if you have questions, please be submitting them through the interface with the webinar. We'll do our best to answer all those questions at the end. And if we don't get to your question, please submit it anyway, because you can follow up with us or we can follow up with you to make sure your questions get answered. With that, let me introduce Chris Collins. Chris Collins is going to be taking us through the report today. He's the head of our technology and entertainment practice at Miller Brown Digital, and he's a bit of a mobile expert. So we're lucky to have him on board sharing some of these insights with everyone today. Chris?
Thank you, Rachel, and good afternoon, everyone. Really excited to be able to share this content with you, and thank you, Rachel, for the introduction. Quick introduction to myself. I currently lead, as Rachel said, the technology and entertainment practice for Miller Brown Digital. In that role, I work with a number of leading telecommunications and technology brands. And previously, I was a consumer wireless analyst for a leading mobile market research firm and spent a number of years as a management consultant, focused primarily on the high-tech and telecommunications space. And I mention all this only because I've really spent the past decade studying and advising clients how consumers research, buy, and use connected devices like smartphone and tablets. And now we're at a point that's really exciting because smartphone penetration is approaching 100% of adults and tablet ownership is surging. And we're really entering sort of the next phase of how marketers can engage consumers via mobile and how consumers can use mobile to change their lives in really interesting ways. So this is some of what we want to touch on today in what we're calling Getting Mobile Right. So we framed up the 3 questions: how can marketers reach consumers on mobile, how can they engage consumers, and then how can they increase their share of consumer activity. And we want to just use these 3 questions to frame up our presentation. But first, why are these so vexing to marketers today? And so if we could move ahead to the next slide. One reason is because mobile is fundamentally changing the media landscape. And so on slide 3, we're showing how mobile has now surpassed TV as the most used screen among multi-screen audiences. Now, the key word here is multi-screen. We're focusing on the behaviors of those consumers that we presume that the people here on the call today are most interested in reaching, who are those who use multiple screens throughout the day. Among those, we know that mobile, which is defined here as the combination of tablet and smartphone, that usage of those 2 screens exceeds that of television. The second reason why the questions we raised at the top are so vexing is because consumers use mobile differently than other devices. So if we move ahead to slide 4, what we see is that there's some very different usage patterns across the 4 primary screens that a multi-screen user will engage with over the course of the day. Just to orient everyone to the data here on slide 4, what we're showing is the screen usage throughout the day, beginning at 6 o'clock in the morning and continuing through the day, through the evening, and then again ending at 6 a.m. that following day. And what you can see is that there's some real interesting patterns among different screen usage. Smartphones are really the do-it-all device. They're used the most frequently overall, and they're used the most frequently for key activities like email, social media, texting, and many productivity tools. Conversely, tablets are used the least throughout the day, and they're often used as an entertainment tool, often on the go. And increasingly, we see a lot of tablet use in the home, watching TV or other content largely in the evenings. Not a surprise that TV is used primarily for entertainment and increasingly for background noise while performing other tasks. And so because of that, we see television used in combination with other screens, and we'll talk more about that in a bit. And then finally, laptops, of course, are used for productivity, specifically during the workday. So we see a peak in laptop usage during the traditional working hours, which is not a surprise. The third reason that the questions we raised are vexing is because these devices are not used in isolation. So multi-screening is a new and powerful phenomenon, but in our research we found that consumers are consuming on average 444 minutes of content, but compressing that into just a 314-minute period. So there's a lot of simultaneous screen usage. And in fact, of the 194 minutes that consumers are using their mobile devices a day, nearly half of that time, 47% of that time, is spent simultaneous with the TV. So the challenge for marketers today in reaching a multi-screen user is to maximize on all of that multi-screen usage and then to break through the fact that in many cases your audience is distracted and working across multiple screens simultaneously. So what this means for marketers is a couple of key things. We've found that it's important to be consistent across all of your screens and deliver a cohesive message. Obviously important to be connected across those screens. Being concise is really important. Obviously, if you're compressing 440 minutes of content into a much smaller period, you're not able to devote the same amount of time to any one individual piece of content. So being concise is critical. And part of being concise is being conscious just of what screen is being used at what time. And we're going to dive into a little bit more of these in a bit. So now let's talk about each of the three questions that we raised at the beginning. And we'll start with our first question. Where and how can marketers reach consumers on mobile? So Rachel, if you'll move ahead to the next slide. What we want to focus on here is the idea that understanding where and how consumers use mobile is critical for successful engagement. And in particular, we want to focus on three of the biggest trends influencing mobile usage: location, social, and context. And by context, we mean specifically mobile app versus browser. So first, on slide 7, this isn't a surprise, but we know that location matters. The majority of consumers are using their mobile devices in really one of two places. Obviously, one is at home, and in fact, a tremendous amount of mobile shopping activity actually does take place in the home, 72%. And then the other is out of the home, and that activity is distributed across a number of different locations. The one that we've highlighted, though, is in-store, because I think that's really one of the really unique aspects of mobile shopping, and certainly a trend that all marketers need to be keenly focused on. In-store mobile shopping is even more powerful when you combine that with our next trend, which on slide 8 is the role of mobile in allowing consumers to connect with their peers through social media. Our research has found that nearly 3/4 of adults aged 18 to 44 access a social network daily, and that smartphones are the most used device for that access. So the interplay between social, location, and mobile is a trend that marketers can't ignore. Diving a little deeper here, one of the things that I found was really interesting is that when consumers are in a store using their social network, more than half of them are using a social network for product or brand discovery or for peer feedback rather than just for socializing. So this means that that intersection, again, of location, mobile, and social is a really influential and critical touch point in a consumer journey especially early in a shopper journey for today's multi-screen consumer. So that's a really critical point, I think, as we think about this upcoming holiday shopping season. We know that mobile commerce numbers are growing, but beyond just pure mobile commerce numbers, we're seeing an explosion of this kind of early shopper consideration activity that takes place in the store and increasingly is supported by social as consumers reach out to one another to learn about brands, to learn about products, and to get that peer feedback. Our final trend is on slide 9, and that's context. And by context here, really, we mean the context for the mobile activity that a consumer may be engaging in, and whether or not that's taking place via mobile app or by browsing the web using a traditional mobile browser and browsing to a brand's m.site, t.site, or their traditional website. And this is a really critical question because in a world of limited resources, we've heard a debate among marketers. Should they invest their time and budget in an app or a mobile browsing experience? And the short answer is, for most brands, it's both. The majority of consumers are using both apps and browsers when mobile shopping. However, a huge percentage, 72%, have fewer than 5 mobile apps installed on their devices. So this means that you need to have a really premium application experience to make that short list, or you're going to essentially encourage your consumers to use a mobile browser experience as an alternative. So you can't ignore one at the expense of the other because consumers are increasingly engaging in both in their shopping journey. So ultimately this means that apps, mobile websites, and a broader mobile search strategy really needs to work seamlessly to provide a best-in-class mobile user experience. So then let's move on to slide 10 and our second key question, which is how can marketers engage consumers with mobile advertising? As we'll see in a bit, mobile has proven to be a very effective advertising tool, and we want to review a few keys that we've learned to making mobile advertising as effective as possible. On slide 11, first we want to share some data that comes from having done years of mobile advertising measurement. Discovered, in fact, is that the average mobile campaign is 2 to 4 times more effective than a PC-based online media campaign. Part of this, I think, is due to the nature of mobile itself, and by that I mean that mobile, as we've talked a little bit so far, is very different from TV and PC. TV, of course, is very much viewed as it's a lean-back activity. You may be engaging in the content, but you're typically in a more passive mindset. PC, by comparison, is a lean-forward activity, and that helps to speak to why we've seen that traditional desktop advertising campaigns are effective as they are. And of course, mobile takes that one step further. It's much more intimate. It's much more personal. People are physically embracing the devices. And so this, I think, has a significant role in why, to date, the mobile advertising campaigns that we've measured have been significantly more effective at driving things like ad awareness and message association. Obviously, of course, part of this is also just due to the fact that, to date, most of the mobile advertising that's in market is from some more innovative brands. And so there's a little bit of self-selection here, and we want to acknowledge that. And I think that's a good point to bring us to our next slide, which is that even though overall mobile advertising is much more effective than desktop, there can still be some better and worse examples of mobile advertising. And we'll show some examples of what can separate those in just a bit. So what can drive better mobile advertising is really dependent on 2 factors, and those 2 are developing the right creative and making smart targeting and placement decisions. So first, let's talk about developing the right creative, specifically with display advertising. Not a surprise given some of what we've touched on so far, but the concepts of short focus messaging is very consistent with what we said earlier around the need to be concise. Persistent branding is critical in mobile display advertising. A full, clear logo present in every frame of the ad we found to be the most effective. And this goes beyond, interestingly enough, just display advertising. I think some of what we've found here in terms of the best advertising, display advertising, also translates actually to just the best mobile web and website design as well. One example from an industry that I focus quite a bit on is T-Mobile, which has been in the midst of a bit of a turnaround. We've been following the news, and you know that they've really embraced their challenger brand approach to the market. And part of that has been reinforced through a rather radical site redesign that they implemented last year. And even though that's a website that's intended to be used on all screens, they've really embraced, I think, a lot of the things that we're highlighting here to help make their content more concise and more easily consumed, and also to reinforce their brand through powerful branding and very short, consistent messaging. Also on the theme of developing the right creative, we've looked at what makes the most effective video ads. And on slide 13, we want to highlight a couple of our findings from our recent research with Tremor Video and the Mobile Marketing Association. We found that there's actually 5 foundations to the most effective interactive mobile video advertising. And 2 in particular, again, should not be a surprise given what we've said to date about the overall challenge of mobile and how consumers are engaging with their multiple screens. Certainly one is to entice and intrigue. It's very difficult to tell an entire story to a consumer in one sitting, especially given how much multi-screen activity and overlapping activities is taking place. But you can certainly entice and intrigue a consumer using effective mobile video. The other important thing that I want to highlight is just making them feel. We've talked about how mobile is a very personal device, and so you want to take advantage of that as much as possible by emphasizing the emotional connection to your brand and to your content in your video advertising. The other key factor that we highlighted earlier is smart targeting and placement decisions. So if we move on to slide 14, I want to share some research that we've found, again, leveraging the hundreds of mobile advertising campaign measurement activities that we've engaged in our mobile market norms database. And this slide has a bit of information density to it, so I want to just take a second to explain what we're showing here. What we've found is that not only are the best targeted mobile ads more effective at driving peak performance for our best mobile advertisers, but interestingly enough, even among our worst mobile advertisers, those campaigns that are appropriately targeted show a positive lift. So this is another way of saying that the best mobile advertisers are going to see significant lifts from targeting in a positive sense, and the worst mobile advertisers are going to see the same benefits, but because they're going to be minimizing the downside, if you will. So this is the key, really, is to understanding smart targeting and placement decisions. And this is, of course, is critical because mobile campaigns have the potential to deliver within the target audience just over half of the time, compared to just 1/3 of the time for online. So appropriate targeting is critical, and having a clear synergy between the creative, as we talked about in the past, and media is key. So let's move on to our third question then, which is how can marketers increase their share of mobile consumer activity? So Rachel, if we move on to slide 15. We've touched on reach and engagement so far. This next question is really focused on consumer activity. And again, we're using activity as an intentionally broad term here because the activity that consumers are engaged in on mobile can vary significantly. But we wanted to share one view of how mobile activity is playing out in the travel space, a space that's relevant to, I'm sure, most of us on the phone today, and certainly to myself. I'm actually speaking to you from Chicago, having flown here for a client meeting. And what's interesting about the data that we're showing here is that there's some very unique and interesting differences in terms of how consumers are using the mobile experiences or applications for key travel brands and those same desktop experiences. I think it's important to highlight that in this study, there's not really a best or worst or a winner or loser, but it is very interesting to see that there's some clear differences in terms of how various brands are leveraging both their desktop experiences and their mobile experiences. Two things that I think are worth highlighting in this data is a brand like Kayak. So Kayak is clearly focused on being a leading source of competitive price and flight information across a very wide range of flight providers. That's an experience that's probably going to be best on a bigger screen, so not surprisingly they have a much bigger share of desktop travel unique visitors. Conversely, a brand like Expedia or TripAdvisor have services that are often consumed in smaller chunks and often on the go, while a traveler may be in the midst of their business travel or leisure travel. So not surprisingly, we see those brands as among the leaders in gaining a share of mobile travel unique visitors. So again, want to highlight that we're not suggesting that either strategy in this case is better or worse, but really just to emphasize the fact that within any given category and for any given brand, understanding how your consumers are using mobile and understanding how to best take advantage of the sort of personal nature that your consumers may have with mobile is critical. One way you can do that is by leveraging competitive benchmarking, as we're highlighting here, to really understand how you compare across your competitive landscape. And so with that, we'll end with a few final thoughts, and then Rachel, I'll hand it back to you for some questions. We started by identifying that mobile today represents a big opportunity. But because it's a big opportunity, it's certainly a challenging opportunity for today's marketers. So in this presentation, we hope we've highlighted how we believe that marketers need to do three things well to get mobile right. First is just understand the role of mobile in the consumer decision journey and how to reach them in the most effective and impactful way. The second piece is to develop a very strong synergy between clear advertising creative, both display and video, and effective media placement to engage consumers on mobile most effectively. And then the third piece of this is to continuously benchmark their brand's mobile performance against their competitors. We focused on travel, but we could have focused on other industries. And that will help them develop two things. One, a real understanding of how their consumers are engaging in mobile in a very personal and meaningful way, but also help them develop a best-in-class mobile experience so they can grow a share of mobile engagement. So with that, I thank you for your time. Apologize for the technical difficulties earlier, but we hope you've enjoyed this and are open for any questions that you might have.
Great. Thank you, Chris. So yes, like Chris said, again, we apologize for the technical difficulties, but we'll now kick off the question and answer section. And as you see, we've gone through this, and with the exception of that last slide we looked at, this is really market overall. We are hosting additional webinars that really dive into the specific pains that really are front and center for each industry. So please stay tuned for the technology-specific one on October 29th and the retail-specific one we have coming up on November 5th. And with that, I'll start to kick over to you, Chris, a few of the questions that we've had come in. So I know you talked about T-Mobile a little bit earlier in terms of brands that are doing or that are getting mobile right. So who else, or can you talk a little more in depth about who have you found that is successful and who's doing mobile well?
Yeah, great question. You know, I think I highlighted T-Mobile as an example of a company that's embracing some of those display advertising techniques and applying it to its broader mobile experience. So that is one company from my industry that I think has done some things interesting recently. Another brand that we highlighted in the travel data, but I didn't speak to specifically, is Southwest. I think Southwest is an interesting brand because of how much they've focused on how their consumers are using mobile and how they can use mobile to improve the overall travel experience. And so now many aspects of the travel experience on Southwest are done almost exclusively through the mobile device, from check-in and they've eliminated boarding passes to even the in-flight experience. They've encouraged the use of mobile tablets and devices for content consumption on their flights. And so I think that's an example of a brand that you wouldn't necessarily think of as a mobile brand, but has nonetheless used mobile in some really interesting ways to transform their customer experience. Another company that I think is worth highlighting is Apple. They were an early leader in mobile commerce in many ways. Certainly the application store and iTunes were some of the earliest examples of people being comfortable with mobile commerce. And now with Apple Pay, they're certainly looking to transition their initial success in digital commerce to retail commerce, traditional retail commerce. But what's interesting about Apple is there's an example of a company that's a leader in some aspects of getting digital right, but is very much still TV first in most of its advertising, and hasn't embraced mobile as an advertising channel the same way that maybe it's embraced it as a transactional channel.
Great, thanks, Chris. So we have had a couple of questions, since I know some of you viewing have had slides skip around a little bit. We will be, after the webinar, we'll be sending out a recording of it for those who couldn't attend, and we will be sending out the slides as well, so you can take a peruse through at your own convenience. If you are sitting there with questions, please enter them into the interface, and if you don't want to do that during this forum, you can always send any questions you have to the email you see on the screen, the digitalsolutions@millwardbrown.com. And with that, Chris, we do have a couple more. So one that wanted to get you to talk a little more about are some big mistakes that you see brands making when it comes to mobile marketing.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think one obvious one is not treating mobile as what it is, which is a unique opportunity to engage with your consumers in a much more personal way than the technologies that have preceded it. So that's maybe another way of saying trying to do the same things that may have worked in your traditional desktop PC online world, and just replicating on those on mobile are certainly not going to work. So, approaching mobile with the same mindset I think is certainly a mistake that a number of brands fall into, and is something that I think we want to work with those brands to help them reconsider. The other big mistake is probably just simply not investing enough. In my experience talking to a number of leading companies, their television and internet measurement teams may have tens or even hundreds of people, and often their mobile teams are one or two people. So there's just a really big resource imbalance there. And I think part of that is because it is hard in many ways to justify the return on additional resources right now. Despite the overwhelming usage of mobile, in many cases we're seeing that the majority of commercial activity is happening on desktop or in store, and it's hard to show a clear, immediate ROI for some of the investments that companies need to make in mobile. That's why I'm very impressed when you see brands make very bold statements about being mobile first and really investing in mobile. I think one interesting example of that is actually Facebook, which has very publicly said they want to be a mobile first company, and they did so at the time when they were the biggest desktop application in the world. So that's, I think, an example of how they've made some powerful changes to become mobile first, and I think more brands need to think that way to get ahead of where the market is really going.
Great. Yeah, I remember when Facebook talked about that actually at our digital CMO summit in April. It's pretty incredible to see that type of transition from a desktop first to a mobile first and do it so successfully. So one more question, Chris, that had come in is, mobile is a big buzzword around boardrooms. How can CEOs right-size the mobile opportunity and know how much focus their brands should be putting towards it?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I think one way to think about that is looking at, again, the data around how their customers are using mobile, both as in general sense, what is usage like, but then, more specifically, how are they engaging with brands in their category, and understand what that usage looks like. And so, I think what we're seeing in a number of categories is that engagement with mobile travel sites, like we showed, even auto shopping sites, is on the rise dramatically, and in particular among younger shoppers, right? So it's very easy to see how the opportunity is going to be significant for mobile in the near term. So I think companies today need to really understand the data and understand it as much as they can on almost a personal level. What I mean by that is really understanding what are those use cases and how are their customers engaging with their mobile devices in a more personal way, and asking questions that I think are maybe different than questions they've asked before, because again, as we said earlier, every brand and every category is going to have a very different use of mobile going forward. So being more open-minded and being more open to different approaches, I think, is going to be even more critical on mobile than it is in previous the internet or television adoption explosion.
Great. So I think that's all the time we have for today. Like I said, if you have additional questions that we didn't get a chance to answer, please feel free to reach out to us at digitalsolutions@millerbrown.com, and we'll follow up with you. Thank you, everyone, for joining.